But Rodrigo Duterte is the new president of the Philippines. This is a guy who ran on the platform of tough on crime. In fact, he was referred to in the Philippines. He was just elected a few months ago. Was referred to in the Philippines as the Philippines Donald Trump. And proudly, yeah, that's me. And he was elected. And he had told a group of reporters, this was earlier this month, and I quote, he's talking about drug users and drug dealers. Drug users, right? The victims of the war on drugs. He said, my order is to shoot to kill you. I don't care about human rights. You better believe me. The Philippine war on drugs. Rodrigo Duterte launched a Filipino version of Richard Nixon's war on drugs. Now, you'll recall Richard Nixon's war on drugs, John Ehrlichman told us, the reason for it was that they wanted to bust up the hippies and they wanted to bust up the civil rights movement, essentially. And so they made heroin and pot super illegal. And, whether they planted it on people or people were using it, they just went after that. Well, this war on drugs in the Philippines is now 7 weeks old. This is as of the 23rd, 3 days ago. 7 weeks old. 1,900 people have died. 1,900 people have died. Over 100,000 Mexicans have died just on our border in the Mexican war on drugs. Millions of Americans have had their lives ruined by the war on drugs in this country since Richard Nixon launched it in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Millions of people. And I would say probably between tens and hundreds of thousands of people have died as a result of the war on drugs. This is crazy. Portugal had the third highest drug addiction rate in Europe. Now that includes, Europe these days now includes a number of very, very, the former Soviet states that are very, very poor countries where they have, that are closer, that are farther south and east and closer to the principal source of heroin these days, and opium, which is Afghanistan. And so there's, a couple of countries that had higher drug addiction rates, but among the developed countries of Europe, the so-called Western European nations, Western and Northern European nations, Portugal was number one in terms of drug addiction, and particularly heroin, and new infections of HIV and Hep C, which come along with, sharing needles. So Portugal decriminalized all drugs. They did the exact opposite of what the Philippines did 8 weeks ago when their new president came in. They did the exact opposite. They decriminalized all drugs. And this was 14 years ago, in 2002. And now they have one of, if not the lowest drug addiction rates in all of Western Europe, arguably probably all of Europe. And the rates of new HIV and Hep C infections have just collapsed. And the organized crime in Portugal, at least that part of organized crime that was involved in the drug trade, it broke their back. They're destroyed. They're gone. Toast. We're watching in real time this terrible mistake in the Philippines. 1,900 people killed in the first 7 weeks in the so-called war on drugs. And whereas in Portugal, the Portuguese government, first of all, everybody in Portugal has free health care. So they stopped treating drug addiction as a crime, started treating it as a medical issue. And drug addicts are now they can get their drugs, and they can get clean syringes if they're using injectable drugs. And we're talking all drugs. LSD, cocaine, heroin, you name it. But the big ones, of course, are heroin and pot. But they decriminalized everything. and had this really, really good result. Whereas here in the United States, there was just a story, I think it was Indiana, might have been Ohio, somewhere in the Midwest, where something like 18 people had died over the course of a day or two because a new batch of heroin arrived and it had been cut with fentanyl or one of these other pharmaceutical drugs that are actually far more potent than heroin. Yes, heroin is not the most potent or addictive opioid drug. There are a number of prescription drugs that are more powerful than heroin. And, you know, in many parts of the world, heroin is used I believe, as a pharmaceutical. It's dihydromorphine, I think is the chemical name for it. And it's just, heroin is just morphine that has had, you know, a slight change to its molecular structure that makes it a little bit more potent than morphine, or arguably a lot more potent than morphine. But this is, you know, these simple lessons for us, how to figure this stuff out. I mean, it's just simple lessons. But there's so much money to be made here in the United States. Oh, and these people who are dying in the United States because they're getting heroin that's laced with, you know, that's been cut with pharmaceuticals. That's because the heroin is illegal, right? I mean, you're not going to end heroin addiction by outlawing it, particularly when you consider that it is, by and large, a medical problem. I mean, addiction is a medical problem. Whether it's addiction to caffeine, to nicotine, to heroin, I mean, you name it, alcohol. These are medical problems that should be treated as medical problems.